who is joining us on Capitol Hill. He is the Washington correspondent, congressional reporter for the Washington Examiner. Thanks as always for being with us.
Anytime, Steve. Thank you.
The House is coming back in now to debate a few bills dealing with easing regulations on small airplanes and oil pipeline standards.
On which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or on which the vote incurs objection under Clause 6 of Rule 20. Record votes on postponed questions will be taken later. For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1848.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar number 109, H.R. 1848, a bill to ensure that the Federal Aviation Administration advances the safety of small airplanes and the continued development of the general aviation industry and for other purposes.
Does the gentleman wish to call up that bill as reported, as amended?
I wish to call up the bill as reported.
As amended.
As amended.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Petri, and the gentlewoman from Nevada, Ms. Titus, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on H.R. 1848.
Without objection.
Yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 1848, the Small Airplane Revitalization Act of 2013. I'd like to commend my colleague, Congressman Mike Pompeo, for introducing this bill, along with Congressman Dan Lipinski, Sam Graves, Richard Nolan, and Todd Rokita. I also ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter of support for H.R. 1848 from the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, Experimental Aircraft Association, General Aviation Manufacturers Association, National Air Transport Association, and National Business Aviation Association, as well as a separate letter of support from the National Air Traffic Controllers Association. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're considering H.R. 1848 today because general aviation is vital to our country. The general aviation industry includes nearly 600,000 pilots, employs 1.3 million people, and contributes approximately $150 billion annually to the U.S. economy. In fact, the general aviation industry is one of the few remaining U.S. manufacturing industries that provide a trade surplus for the U.S., and it has a presence in every one of our 435 congressional districts. However, the last several decades, the general aviation industry has experienced unique challenges, including a steady decline in new pilots, flight activity, and the sale of new aircraft. In part, these challenges are due to overly prescriptive and outdated certification processes, which greatly increase the cost of bringing new products to market and ultimately increase the cost for consumers. The bill before us is intended to address these challenges by streamlining the certification process for small airplanes, making it more efficient and effective, while also protecting the important safety oversight function of the FAA. The goal is to improve safety at a fraction of the cost. For example, the leading cause of fatalities in general aviation is due to loss of control. There are several existing technologies available to mitigate loss of control, such as an angle of attack indicator. However, in a FAA-certified airplane, the purchase and installation of this equipment is about $5,000, whereas the exact same piece of equipment in a non-certified experimental airplane is about $800. So right now, the FAA's complicated and costly small airplane certification process provides a disincentive to certify new airplanes and safety equipment. Just one example of how the Small Airplane Revitalization Act will improve safety at a fraction of the cost. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from Florida, Nevada is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is
We'll give you
recognized.
such time as
Thank you,
you
Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 1848, the Small Airplane Revitalization Act of 2013. H.R. 1848 would require the Federal Aviation Administration to update its Part 23 Small Airplane Design Regulations by December 31, 2015. Last week, the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee ordered H.R. 1848 reported favorably to the House by a voice vote. In June, an FAA-chartered Part 23 Aviation Rulemaking Committee, or ARC, submitted its comprehensive report with recommendations for rewriting and reorganizing Part 23 to the agency. Representatives from the FAA, international regulatory agencies, aircraft manufacturers, general aviation pilot groups, and labor unions all participated in the ARC. Its work followed a 2009 FAA report on the small airplane certification process and fulfilled requirements in Section 312 of the FAA Authorization Bill. Mr. Speaker, prior to the Part 23 ARC, the agency's most recent comprehensive review of Part 23 was almost 30 years ago in 1984. Part 23 has not kept up with the times. These regulations are prescriptive in nature, often written to address out-of-date technologies. As a result, they are creating cost barriers for certifying new airplanes and retrofitting older aircraft with new safety-enhancing modifications. The need to improve the process for retrofitting older aircraft is particularly urgent, given the 40-year-old average age of the U.S. general aviation fleet. Small airplane manufacturers and parts suppliers across the country are limited in their ability to innovate with new technology because of these outdated regulations. This bill will allow these manufacturers to innovate more quickly and bring more safety technology online. H.R. 1848 will fast-track the Part 23 ARC's work by requiring the FAA to draft a new regulation that emphasizes performance-based safety objectives. These new regulations make the retrofit of new technology more straightforward and also remove barriers to bringing new, safer airplane designs to market. It will help small business, and I urge support. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
I yield such time as you may consume to our colleague from the 4th District of Kansas, Mike Pump.
The gentleman from Kansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the gentleman from Wisconsin. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the general aviation industry and ask my fellow members to support the Small Aircraft Revitalization Act. This is a common sense, bipartisan, broadly bipartisan regulatory reform bill will spur economic growth, improve aviation safety, and help strengthen the health of the lighter entry-level segment of the industry. Mr. Speaker, there is no better reason to support this legislation than it saves lives and improves lives. Think about that. We can do both in one fell swoop. Let's first talk about how the bill improves lives. I represent Wichita, Kansas. It is the air capital of the world. It is home to Cessna and Learjet and Beechcraft and dozens and dozens and dozens of suppliers to those great aviation businesses with such great aviation histories. It's the home of the National Institute for Aviation Research and the National Center for Aviation Training. There are engineers, machinists, researchers, flight instructors, fixed-base operators, among others, that all depend on a healthy general aviation industry. And then there are the operators in the industry in general aviation. This vital productivity tool for both small and large companies all across the country is critically important. 16 years ago, I joined the Kansas general aviation industry, building a business with 3 of my colleagues, founding a company called Thayer Aerospace, a machine shop in Wichita, Kansas. We made parts for the thriving aircraft industry. But the downturn in 2008 was a tremendous blow to Wichita in particular and general aviation more generally. We experienced thousands and thousands of layoffs and dramatic downsizing all across the region. The downturn exacerbated the unique challenges that the lighter entry-level segment of general aviation has been experiencing over the past several decades. Today, the average general aviation airplane is 40 years old. That means most of the new aircraft were built in the 1960s and 1970s with designs of that same vintage. Current general aviation production represents less than 2% of the existing fleet. And we've had over 10,000 person per year decline in active private pilots over this last decade. The steady decline in new pilots and flight activity and the sales of new small general aviation airplanes that result from that are indicators of significant problems in the industry. To tackle this problem, this bill, the Small Aircraft Revitalization Act, requires the FAA to implement FAA's Part 23 certification process and modernize it no later than 2015. Part 23 is composed of aviation authorities, the FAA Part 23 Reorganization Aviation Review Committee, ARC, composed of aviation authorities, industry representatives from around the world, has worked over the last 18 months to create a regulatory environment that will contribute to revitalizing the health and safety of new and existing airplanes. These changes will remove lots and lots of barriers. It will improve lives. Let me tell you how it will save lives. The gentleman from Wisconsin talked about safety and innovation being retarded by the absence of a streamlined regulatory process. He spoke of this example of loss of control. That creates more than 3 times the cause of aviation accidents than any other single cause. Since the dawn of aviation, we've taught pilots how to avoid that, but because there remains a significant safety problem, there's tremendous interest in technology and interventions to resolve it. And yet today's Part 23 makes that more difficult. By putting these technologies into the new and existing fleet, it's widely believed that the safety of light general aviation aircraft could see dramatic improvements. We need to cut this red tape. It will create savings for sure, but more importantly, it will save lives. This is a common sense and important reform. America's general aviation industry is not asking for a single handout, not one subsidy. It's simply asking for a streamlined set of regulations that will permit them to get their airplanes, their designs, to market more quickly and still doing so safely. I want to thank Chairman Schuster and Chairman LoBiondo for their support, and my original co-sponsors, Mr. Nolan, Mr. Lipinski, Mr. Graves of Missouri, and Mr. Rokita, and all the folks of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee on both sides of the aisle that have allowed this bill to get this far and make it to the floor. I urge support of all of my colleagues this evening and hope we'll have unanimous vote in behalf of this bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Nevada is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would yield 3 minutes now to the gentleman from Minnesota.
Mr. Speaker, I ask to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, first I'd like to thank Representative Pompeo for sponsoring this important legislation, and of course thanks to our Chairman Schuster and Rahal, and to both my Democratic and Republican colleagues on the committee for bringing this Small Aircraft Revitalization Act to the floor of the Congress in such an expeditious and bipartisan manner. Mr. Speaker, by streamlining and modernizing the rules and regulations that govern our small aircraft industry, we'll be encouraging the investment necessary to generate thousands of new American jobs. And what this legislation does, in effect, is put together a regulatory regime that will be specifically tailored for small aircraft industry, that will allow the industry to develop performance and outcome-based ways of achieving important safety standards. It allows them to put together consensus regulations that are developed by industry, by the government regulators, by private, profit, nonprofit associations, and enables the industry to really unleash technologies of the future, creating jobs. I'm so proud of Cirrus Manufacturing in my district, up in Duluth, Minnesota. They've developed a parachute that is attached to the airplane, and like a skydiver, in this case, the airplane, if it stalls in the sky, it can pull a ripcord and parachute the plane down to safety. And these are the kind of technologies that have the potential to be released through this legislation. What it does, in short, is enable the designers, the engineers, the manufacturers, the creators, the skilled workers to release all their brilliance, creating the best, safest airplane technologies going forward into the future. So I applaud the committee, my colleagues, the Congress for bringing this forward in such an expeditious manner, and strongly urge all my colleagues to support this important piece of legislation.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield such time as you may consume to our colleague from the 25th District of Texas, Representative Roger Williams.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The general aviation industry is a vital part of the economy in Texas' 25th District. Between the Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport and Austin-Bergstrom Airport, there are dozens of smaller regional airports. Passing H.R. 1848 is not only important to those in general aviation, it is vital. As my colleagues have mentioned, this industry includes nearly 600,000 pilots, employs 1.3 million people, and contributes approximately $150 billion annually to the U.S. economy. But because the current regulations are overly strict and dated, our economy and workforce is struggling. General aviation fosters a robust workforce of engineers, manufacturers, maintenance professionals, and pilots, and it is within the FAA's power to ensure the success and sustainability of this important industry. They can do this by modernizing the regulatory requirements to improve safety, decrease cost, and set new standards for compliance and testing, just as H.R. 1848 requires. Mr. Speaker, I'm a small businessman. I can tell you this is good for jobs, it's good for the economy, and most importantly, it's good for America. I yield back.
It's back. The gentlelady from Nevada is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Georgia.
The gentleman is recognized. 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the lady for the time. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 1848, the Small Airplane Revitalization Act of 2013. This bill improves safety, lowers costs, and stimulates private sector innovation, all while cutting red tape. We need to do everything we can to keep our economy growing. For the last year and a half, representatives from the Federal Aviation Administration and the aviation industry have worked together to make recommendations for regulations that will keep us safe in the sky and grow our economy back on the ground. This bill adopts those recommendations. I'm proud to stand with the bipartisan group of congressmen who helped bring this bill to the floor today, including Mr. Pompeo, Mr. Lipinski, Mr. Rakita, Mr. Noland, and my co-chair of the General Aviation Task Force, Mr. Graves. This bill follows in the tradition of the General Aviation Caucus in the House to work together in a bipartisan fashion. That's the way things should be done around here, and this bill is proof that good things can happen when Republicans and Democrats work together. I encourage all my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Does the gentlelady have additional speakers?
I don't. I'd yield back.
The gentlelady yields back.
Mr. Speaker, in closing, I'd like to reiterate that this bill is about good government, about creating a regulatory environment that improves safety at a fraction of the cost, and ultimately about helping to revitalize an American industry. I strongly urge all of my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 1848 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds, and the two-thirds being in the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker, ask for the yeas and nays.
Gentleman asks for the yeas and yeas. The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20. Further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2611.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
House Calendar Number 42, H.R. 2611, a bill to designate the headquarters building of the Coast Guard on the campus located at 2701 Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue Southeast in the District of Columbia as the Douglas A. Monroe Coast Guard Headquarters Building and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Petri, and the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the bill before us, H.R. 2611.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the bill before us, H.R. 2611, would designate the United States Coast Guard headquarters in Washington, D.C. as the Douglas A. Munro Coast Guard Headquarters Building. Douglas Munro was born in Vancouver, Canada, of American parents on October 11, 1919, and grew up in Washington State. He attended the Central Washington College of Education for a year and left to enlist in the United States Coast Guard in 1939. He served the country during World War II, rising to the rank of signalman first class. Douglas Munro was killed in action at Guadalcanal on September 27, 1942, shielding 500 United States Marines from enemy fire during an evacuation. He volunteered to head the boats for the evacuation, and he placed himself and his boats as cover for the last Marine to leave. During this time, Douglas Munro was fatally wounded. Reportedly, he remained conscious long enough to say 4 words. Did they get off? Douglas Munro was awarded the Medal of Honor and the Purple Heart. The bravery and sacrifice of Douglas Munro saved hundreds of Marines and should be honored and remembered. I think it's appropriate to ensure that he will always be remembered by naming the United States Coast Guard headquarters in his honor. Therefore, I support the passage of this legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from the District of Columbia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman for his remarks. The timing on this bill could not be more appropriate. Later this month, we will cut the ribbon for the new Coast Guard building, the first building the Coast Guard has ever owned. Next month, the Coast Guard employees will begin moving into the building located on the old St. Elizabeth's Hospital campus in southeast Washington. It is only fitting that the Coast Guard should be moving into a building named for one of their own, Signalman First Class Douglas Albert Munro. Signalman First Class is the U.S. Coast Guard's Signalman First Class Munro is the U.S. Coast Guard's only Medal of Honor recipient. The Coast Guard specifically requested that I write this bill in time for the opening of the Coast Guard, and I want to express my appreciation to my good friends on the other side for promptly passing this bill in committee last week and then seeing to it that it got to the floor on this first bill for the first set of bills for the week. Munro died heroically on Point Cruz, Guadalcanal, after succeeding in his volunteer assignment to evacuate a detachment of Marines that had been overwhelmed by the enemy. Signalman First Class Munro had an outstanding record as an enlisted man and was promoted rapidly through the various ratings to a Signalman First Class. In addition to being a Medal of Honor recipient, Signalman First Class Munro was also posthumously awarded the Purple Heart Medal and was eligible for the American Defense Service Medal, the Asiatic Pacific Area Campaign Medal, and the World War II Victory Medal. This indeed was a hero. Signalman First Class Munro is an excellent example of the commitment of the service and bravery that our men and women of the Coast Guard still provide today, much of it here at home. It is an honor to be the lead sponsor of this bill to name the building in honor of a true American hero. The new Coast Guard headquarters building that would be named for Signalman First Class Douglas A. Munro will be a 1.1 million square foot building and will house up to 3,700 members of the U.S. Coast Guard and civilian employees. This building, which will be the first office building completed for the Department of Homeland Security headquarters, consolidation will mark the first time that a federal agency will be located east of the Anacostia River. I believe that Signalman First Class Douglas A. Monroe's outstanding service to his country and his unique status as the only member of the U.S. Coast Guard to win the Medal of Honor ensures that it is particularly fitting to name the new U.S. Coast Guard headquarters the Douglas A. Monroe Coast Guard Headquarters Building. I urge my colleagues to support this measure.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
I don't yield back. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized. The gentleman reserves. The gentlelady's from the District of Columbia.
I want only to say in closing, then, Mr. Speaker, that Signalman, we honor Signalman Monroe by naming a first-class, extraordinary, state-of-the-art building after him. But in honoring Signalman Monroe, I think we also honor members of the Coast Guard. These are, to coin a cliche, real unsung heroes in our society. They are the men and women who save men and women and children every year right here in our country as part of their duties here. So that in a real sense, when we name this building for the only Medal of Honor winner, I think it will make Americans also understand that there are many heroes of the Coast Guard who also serve them every day of every year. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Speaker, I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 2611? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no.
Speaker, on that I demand the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2576.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 110, H.R. 2576, a bill to amend Title 49, United States Code, to modify requirements relating to the availability of pipeline safety regulatory documents and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Petri, and the gentlewoman from Nevada, Ms. Titus, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on H.R. 2576.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that an exchange of letters with the Energy and Commerce Committee be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise in support of the bill before us, H.R. 2576. This bill is a correction of an unintended consequence of the Bipartisan Pipeline Safety Regulatory Certainty and Job Creation Act of 2011. It's sponsored by Chairman Denham of the Subcommittee on Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials, along with full committee Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member Rahal, and Subcommittee Ranking Member Brown. Last Congress, Section 24 of the Pipeline Safety Act included a good faith provision intended to make the pipeline safety regulations and guidance of the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA, more transparent. It did so by requiring any document or portion thereof incorporated by reference into the new regulations and guidance of PHMSA be made available free of charge on the Internet. In so doing, however, an unintended consequence of this language was created that, contrary to the intent of Congress, has adversely impacted the ability of PHMSA to move forward with its regulatory agenda by placing practical barriers on PHMSA's ability to rely on the state-of-the-art technical standards written by standards developing organizations, referred to as SDOs. This bill simply corrects this unintended outcome and preserves the intellectual property rights of these organizations while still meeting the goals of a transparent government with free access to standards for non-commercial purposes. Specifically, the bill allows for standards to be made free of charge, but strikes, quote, on an internet website, end quote, which allows PHMSA and SDOs more leeway to comply with the law. It also gives industry and PHMSA extra time to comply by making it effective 3 years from enactment instead of 1 year. Finally, the bill limits the applicability of the provision to only pipeline safety organizations. I believe that this bipartisan technical correction will provide PHMSA with the flexibility needed to continue to fully leverage its partnership with standards developing organizations and save the government money by not requiring PHMSA to develop its own technical standards for rulemaking. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from Nevada is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. On January 3, 2012, President Obama signed into law the Pipeline Safety, Regulatory Certainty, and Job Creation Act of 2011. Section 24 of that Act states that, effective January 3, 2013, the Secretary of Transportation may not issue, and I quote, guidance or a regulation that incorporates by reference any documents or portions thereof, unless the documents or portions thereof are made available to the public, free of charge or on an Internet website. During the last Congress, the Subcommittee on Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials held a number of hearings on pipeline safety, one of which highlighted a current regulation that required pipeline operators to develop and implement public education and awareness programs. The regulation did not explain what should be contained in the education programs, however. Instead, it pointed readers to an industry-developed standard. But in order to read the standard, you had to pay the drafters more than $1,000. If you're a small community, $1,000 is a lot of money for access to just one of many pipeline safety standards. I and many of my colleagues have concerns about the federal government issuing a regulation that requires whoever wants to read it, particularly local communities, first responders, and private citizens, to have to purchase it from a private association. Fortunately, the 2011 Act resolved this situation. Following enactment of Section 24, DOT held a public workshop and webcast with more than 70 industry, safety, and government representatives present to discuss options for implementing the new law. Nearly 200 other entities participated in the webcast. Additional comments were provided through the Federal Register notice, including by the Small Business Administration, which noted many concerns of small businesses with the continued use of incorporation by reference. Since the workshop, several standards development organizations have agreed in writing to electronically post on the Internet all of the consensus standards that the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration incorporates by reference into the federal pipeline safety regulations. Those include ASTM International, the Manufacturers Standardization Society, the Gas Technology Institute, NACE, N-A-C-E International, the National Fire Protection Association, the American Petroleum Institute, the American Gas Association, and others. So I ask unanimous consent to include their letters in the congressional record.
Without objection.
I also ask that the letters from the Pipeline Safety Trust, Dakota Rural Action, and Columbia law professor Peter Strauss expressing the need for public availability of the standards also be included in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Unfortunately, some organizations have expressed concerns about posting their standards on the Internet. This has in turn held up progress of several important safety rulemakings that were mandated in the 2011 pipeline law. So in the spirit of bipartisanship and not wanting to hold up the rulemaking process, I believe the law should be modified to provide DOT with additional time to implement it and with additional flexibility to determine how best to make the standards widely available to the public. I believe that even with these changes that are in the law will continue to address the transparency and openness concerns of the safety community. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
I have no further requests for time and reserve the balance of my time.
We have no further speakers.
Does the gentlelady yield back?
I do. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back.
Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill, H.R. 2576? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the gentleman from Wisconsin.
On that, I demand the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise, remain standing until counted. The yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 12, Section A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until approximately 6:30 p.m. today.
The House will be back in for votes on measures just debated at 6:30 Eastern. Later this week, the House debates a couple of bills postponing parts of the new health care law. House Speaker John Boehner urged members today to support the bills delaying the employer mandate, which the Obama administration already postponed for a year, and also the individual mandate. Speaker Boehner called the employer mandate without the individual mandate delay unfair to American families.
My colleagues, building a stronger economy for all Americans